Welcome to today's Hill briefing on fixing America's broken disaster housing recovery system. We'll give it a minute for folks to join on the line and get started soon. All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Sara, and I'm the Vice President of Public Policy for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And I want to thank you for joining today's Hill briefing on fixing America's broken disaster recovery system. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition has been working on disaster housing recovery for 15 years since Hurricane Katrina. And more recently, from our work leading the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition of about 850 local, state, and national organizations, many with direct experience recovering from disasters. From this experience, we've reached a simple conclusion. America's disaster housing recovery system is fundamentally broken. It consistently exacerbates the housing crisis, solidifies segregation, and deepens inequality. When disasters strike, the lowest income and most marginalized people often are hardest hit. They have the fewest resources and they face the longest, steepest path to recovery. Yet, these are the same households that are the least likely to receive FEMA assistance, and too long-term recovery and mitigation efforts overlook the urgent needs in their communities. For example, federal policy tends to prioritize protocol over outcome. It relies on programs that are inaccessible or unhelpful to low-income people, creates unnecessary and arbitrary deadlines, and refuses to release data on program requirements or outcomes. FEMA, for example, has consistently failed to learn lessons from past disasters and apply them to future efforts. A clear example of that has been the failure of FEMA and the refusal of FEMA to activate the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, which both Republican and Democratic administrations have upheld as a best practice to help families find permanent housing solutions after a disaster. And instead, FEMA has relied on programs that low-income and marginalized families struggle to access or use. As a result, we've seen homelessness increase, often in communities after disasters. After Hurricane Maria, FEMA implemented arbitrary deadlines that required Puerto Ricans who had evacuated the island to leave FEMA-funded hotels before they had alternative housing in place. And as a result, homelessness increased in communities with Puerto Rican evacuees by 14% in Massachusetts and by 17% in Connecticut. After we saw homelessness increase in Houston by 18%, and nearly 20% of all people experiencing homelessness in the city reported that they became homeless as a result of the disaster. This is nothing but a stunning indictment of how failed our disaster housing response is. FEMA-funded programs exacerbate racial inequities. After Hurricane Harvey, for example, nearly half of disaster survivors with the lowest incomes, who are mostly people of color, were denied FEMA assistance. The vast majority of higher income, mostly white households, on the other hand, were approved. The average white family in the higher income neighborhoods received about $60,000 in assistance per person, while Black families in poor neighborhoods received an average of $84 per person. These are huge disparities that are completely unacceptable. FEMA also frequently denies assistance to survivors because of inflexible requirements. We'll hear later on about a title documentation issue that has led to 77,000 people in Puerto Rico to be denied assistance because of FEMA refusing to make accommodations to serve those households. That same title issue we've seen in after Hurricane Michael, where FEMA denied assistance to as many as 50% of applicants in certain parts of the Panhandle, and in California after the wildfires. In nearly all cases, FEMA has refused to modify its programs and to accommodate applicants in need. They've known about this program since this issue since 1995 and has done little to remedy it. But these are just some of the examples of how our country's broken disaster housing recovery system neglects people who are most in need. And even today, we're seeing just how broken this system is with the growing wildfires on the West Coast. Not only are these fires destroying homes and causing displacement, but the smoke poses an immediate threat to unsheltered individuals. FEMA should now activate its programs in Oregon, California, and Washington to get unsheltered homeless people into safety now. But we aren't seeing them take enough action or action quick enough. It is extraordinarily dangerous for people living in tents, cars, RVs, and on sidewalks to be breathing in ash and smoke. And we're working with our partners and watching this very closely as the days unfold. To address many of the systemic barriers that we've seen in disaster housing recovery, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition hosted a convening with our partners across many sectors, including housing and homelessness, fair housing, research, civil rights, disability rights, and other sectors. And together, we reimagined what a federal disaster housing recovery system could look like if it were centered on the needs of those who are most impacted, those with the lowest incomes, and those who are most marginalized. We published the findings of that convening in a new report published this summer. It is the second in a two-part series published with the Fair Share Housing Center of New Jersey that documents both the barriers to and solutions for an equitable housing recovery. As we'll discuss in this hearing or this Hill briefing, we must rebuild a disaster housing recovery system, and racial equity and equity for all marginalized and impacted people needs to be central and explicit in federal policy goals. There also must be opportunities for public engagement, for systemic transparency, for full accountability and due process, for robust civil rights enforcement, fair housing and fair mitigation practices, and a focus on increasing local capacity and benefit. All of these priorities need to be reflected in every stage of disaster recovery and response. And while we know this process will take many years, there are immediate steps that Congress can take that we can discuss a little bit later. Some of those ideas include permanently authorizing the Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery Program and providing safeguards to ensure that funds are spent equitably, permanently authorizing disaster vouchers and activating it after every disaster so that families who are displaced from their homes can make use of that and have a permanent, affordable place to live. Requiring FEMA to activate that program now for people who are experiencing homelessness, who have been moved into hotels to help contain the spread of COVID, so that they are not pushed back into homelessness after this pandemic ends, as well as enacting legislation to fix title issues at FEMA and to ensure basic transparency, due process, and other systemic transparency issues are addressed. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm so excited to have this panel of experts. We've been working with many of them for many years on disaster recovery issues, and these are the experts I turn to when I have questions about how to address disaster recovery issues and what policy reforms will be needed. So I think we have a really great panel ahead of us for today. We're going to start our conversation about what the most immediate needs are in recently impacted communities in Iowa and Louisiana. Then we'll turn to some of our experts who've been working over many, many years on disaster recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, Texas, and New Jersey. And finally, we'll have a discussion about some policy ideas for reform at the federal level. So with that, I'll turn over the mic to Sara Buck, who's the Housing Services Manager for the City of Cedar Rapids. Sara?
Good afternoon. Yes, thank you very much for having me. Again, my name is Sara Buck. I'm the Housing Services Manager for the City of Cedar Rapids. I oversee the Housing Choice Voucher Program for Cedar Rapids, which we cover Lynn and Benton County, as well as the CDBG and home programs. We're an entitlement community with those fund sources coming into our city as well. So on August 10th, obviously we had been dealing with the derecho or dealing with COVID since late March and working through sheltering options and other issues prior to our disaster, or what we're calling our second disaster. But the derecho, which is essentially an inland hurricane, came through Iowa on August 10th and caused mass destruction through all 75 square miles of Cedar Rapids, as well as our surrounding metro area, a couple other cities that are surrounding us, plus just damages to farmland. I think they said roughly 80 to 90% of our farmland was destroyed in this area. We had 240,000 people without power. We lost about 2/3 of our tree canopy within our city. So really mass destruction. There was, I don't think, a single property that wasn't damaged in some matter or form within our city limits and then our surrounding area as well. Trees fallen down on homes, trees through people's roofs. We had no power, no communication. Cell tower were down minimally for the first day. We started to see some restoration to our cell service on like day 2 and 3, but I think the scariest piece of this was just the loss of communication. So we knew that everyone needed help, but really had no way connection to people other than boots on the ground, which again is very difficult during COVID with everything else going on. But some of the things that as we started moving through recovery and trying to figure out, just assess the overall damage, some of the things that I wanted to talk about today that were real eye-opening issues for us. I mean, we were already at like a 2.2 vacancy rate, which is extremely low. I think a healthy market is right around 5%. So we were already at a loss of any type of available housing. But I would say for affordable units, anything under, for like the 60% area median income folks, was probably more like right around 0.1 or 0.2%. So extremely low for those families that need affordable housing or lower income housing. And then also any HUD funded properties. So we oversee the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but we don't have any public housing through the city. But there are several buildings that are have their own contract with HUD. So some of these are senior housing, and they have some higher needs individuals, either elderly or disabled folks that really had required to have power. So when our power was out for some folks up to 2 to 3 weeks, that was extremely difficult for someone who was afraid to go to sleep because they require a CPAP machine that they couldn't plug in. So, just those fears with these families, definitely a huge concern. My larger concern was that once we were able to identify that they needed power, we were able to work with our social service agencies to get generators out to these people. But, if we're putting money, and I mean we as in the state or the federal government, we should make it a requirement for these agencies to have a disaster plan in place. Who is going to be taking care of things when disasters happen? Who's going to check up on these people when they need help? Are we requiring generators in these buildings on new builds or in rehabs when we're putting federal dollars into these buildings? Should they require a generator for someone when you know that they're going to have a high needs population, whether it's disabled or elderly? That would be one of my requests, and I don't know enough about those contracts to know what those requirements are, but it definitely was not a requirement in this one particular building that made state and national news because people weren't getting their needs met. So that would be one thing I would bring up. The other piece is that tree debris is not a covered expense for FEMA if it is not on the actual structure of the property. Many insurance companies are also either giving very little money or no money to debris in the yard. So if you had 2 large 100-year-old trees fall in your yard and it's blocking your driveway, but it's not on your structure, who's paying to help clean that up? Because it could be thousands of dollars for these folks. So when the entire city's kind of in this same state, the city, Cedar Rapids or Lynn County can't do all of this on their own. And we've been blessed to have a lot of volunteers come in and assist with that, but there's still quite a bit of debris that hasn't been cleaned up in people's yards, and just general access for emergency situations is also a concern. And then FEMA denials. I think, thank you, Sarah, for your wonderful introduction. It was a very touching and relatable right now. I have been told by some folks that it's very similar to Social Security disability. You have to keep applying and reapplying and appealing decisions. And when people are in need and don't have money to stay somewhere tonight, hearing the denial is very disheartening. Some people are giving up. They're in distress. Families that do not speak English don't understand what that means. They just assume that the denial is permanent and they have no rights to an appeal. So absolutely, I could see where people with language barriers or other disabilities that may not interpret those things correctly or read the notice thoroughly to understand their rights. Iowa Legal Aid has been wonderful and as an outreach partner to kind of assist people with that. But again, the challenge is getting those resources in the hands of those people. And say it all you want, but it is difficult. And I know I'm going to drag on here, but the other piece is that rental insurance or insurance is only covering part-time stays in hotel rooms. So you get a week to 2 weeks in a hotel with your insurance, and then you run out of money. So initially when Red Cross was here and they left at about 2 weeks after the disaster, stating that they just weren't seeing the numbers come into shelter. Well, many times the insurance were covering this, but after that week to 2 weeks, then they started coming into shelter and Red Cross was gone. So I think it's just timing and understanding all of the processes. And if people are able to get insurance money for that short time to cover a hotel room, then who is helping in that interim 2 week to 3 month time period? Because all of our housing has been impacted. So my typical, I would go to home assistance, home grants to assist homeowners or to assist people with rental assistance. But I can't do that because none of these properties even will pass inspection based on those requirements by home. So, I mean, all of these things just compound and I'm unable to use the funds that I'm getting through COVID for disaster recovery. There's no disaster recovery money coming in quickly enough for us to access it. And there's just really this interim need of the kind of, like I said, that 2 week to 3+ months until our housing is repaired and we can get people back into housing. And I'll stop with that. You can ask any questions.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I remember we talked before about how this recovery is made more difficult by the pandemic. Maybe you could just share a minute or two about how that experience has been.
Yeah, it has. So just even meeting with people is difficult, but already our shelters are at a reduced rate of how many people that they can assist due to the social distancing. So when Red Cross came in, we had another congregate shelter that we had available for people. When they left after like that second week, we didn't have any other option for shelter, and so again, we had to work with the county and open an overflow shelter, which we typically would open from November through March for weather seasonal type housing as additional shelter for people that when the shelters are full, typically hire in the wintertime. We were able to open that kind of as, in a reaction to the Red Cross closing their congregate shelter. But you still have this high need of people with medical conditions or COVID positive people, and where are you putting them into a non-congregate shelter? And just that process, working and getting permission from FEMA for a non-congregate shelter is very difficult. There's an application. If anybody's had to work through that, I've had to redo that application like 3 times before it was finally approved. It is not fun. And just getting the approval process. And then right now, how you can't even find a hotel room. So, if I have someone come into shelter who's COVID positive, I can't even put them in a non-congregate shelter because those hotels are full. Where am I putting people? I mean, it's really a struggle right now with COVID.
Yeah, that sounds like a tremendous challenge, and I appreciate all of your work that you've been doing there, and we'll stay in touch over the coming months to work together on that, and appreciate you joining us. Now
Yeah,
we'll turn to a longtime advocate, somebody who has extensive experience with disaster recovery, Andreanecia, who's the Executive Director of Housing Louisiana, to talk about the impacts of Hurricane Laura.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Good
Yes.
afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. And I want to thank the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for hosting this briefing and discussing this very important issue. As Sarah mentioned, unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina is the genesis of the modern disaster era. And so we certainly know what's happening here. And it's the height of irony that Hurricane Laura showed up on the 15th anniversary, almost to the week, almost to the day, 15 years after Hurricane Katrina sideswiped New Orleans, and the floodwaters from the levee failures actually wreaked havoc in the city, and set us on a course that we're still dealing with. Hurricane Laura, just for a quick geography, hit primarily in the area of Lake Charles, which is almost as west as you can get, and still be in the state of Louisiana, opposite of New Orleans. And so that means that this disaster didn't hit New Orleans in the same way. The devastation that impacted Laura, just as a quick calibration for everyone, this was the worst hurricane to make direct landfall in the state of Louisiana in over 100 years. Again, more devastating than Katrina because of the intensity and the impact. And so the areas that it went over were largely rural. Lake Charles is one of the largest cities in that area with about 90,000 people. So, smaller communities, but no less devastated. They were able to evacuate, and so people were able to get out. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of loss of life. And it looks like most of the loss of life relating to the storm is going to come in the form of not having proper shelter and people not being able to get back. We've lost several people due to heat stroke because it is southeast Louisiana, and because of climate change, we are now seeing, it's still in the 90s, heat index of 100 in September, and people dying from carbon monoxide poisoning who are trying to tough it out in homes that don't have power. The Lake Charles area has been devastated. They actually don't have water, drinkable water, or electricity, so it's really not possible to be there. And this is one of the struggles that we're seeing with coordinating, making sure that people have shelter. Because this all happened inside of COVID, there is an alignment and an opportunity for alignment. We have a different situation than our friends in Cedar Rapids, and our hearts go out to them. Our economy is largely based on tourism, and because of COVID, we have had hotels that have been vacant for months that eagerly took on the evacuees from Southwest Louisiana. New Orleans has actually run out of room in its hotels in New Orleans. But this also speaks to the underlying inequity when your economy is based on tourism. So that meant that a lot of people had been laid off in the preceding months, and maybe these folks could go back to work. Unfortunately, that has not happened, as the hotels are not providing full service to their guests. They're actually they're rehiring people using temporary services instead of bringing back the people they laid off a few months ago. So this is, and this is at the heart of these inequities. While we are grateful I'm personally grateful that we had the room to house those individuals and those families from the Lake Charles area who needed somewhere to stay. The fact of the matter is that this needs to be done in an equitable fashion that's not simply trickle down. We really do need to be stabilizing everyone. New Orleans had a 20% vacancy rate pre-COVID. So, and again, that's largely due to us not resolving or addressing Hurricane Katrina and rebuilding in an equitable fashion. And so we want to make sure, and this is one of the things why we've been grateful to participate in these conversations about disaster recovery and making sure that it is equitable. It doesn't seem like the lessons that we learned, that everyone learned that there were massive inequities in New Orleans as a result of Hurricane Katrina. it doesn't seem like anyone learned what to do about it. And while many of us have been talking about this and advocating for it, and many of us do know what to do, it doesn't seem like our decision makers at any level have any of that capacity. And so we are once again, and it's hard to be hopeful after we have been so disappointed in the response to COVID, but we have to have hope. We are not going to let our neighbors in Lake Charles and the other parts of Louisiana that were impacted by Hurricane Laura, fall down if we can help it. We're going to do everything that we can to make sure that they do receive the assistance necessary. And it's highly charged and very political arena. The folks who have been impacted by Laura are going to need a recovery bill. So do the people who've been impacted by COVID, and so do the people who were housing insecure prior to COVID. We need leaders at the federal, state, and local level to create resources and opportunities that prioritize every American having access to safe, decent, and accessible housing during this time. The CDC's eviction moratorium is extraordinary in many ways, and one of the things that's most extraordinary about it is that it clearly says that no one should be made homeless, no one should be at risk of doubling up, and no one should be living in substandard housing. That is incredible. What we need is at every level for that to ring true, and to see that, and that needs to be the response every time we have one of these catastrophes and one of these disasters. One of the other challenges that we're dealing with is while the hotels are filled in New Orleans, there are other vacant hotels, and there's still people. That's why people are dying from carbon monoxide poisoning and heat stroke, because they are still staying in homes and apartments that do not have electricity, and they don't know how to access the FEMA hotel programs. Interestingly enough, and it's available. It is available, but we're having to the point that both the Saras were making is the lack of coordination. Interestingly enough, they're sending around texts letting people know you can text if you need shelter. Well, if you're in a home that doesn't have power and you're in an area that was devastated, I mean, we need to be a little more strategic than this, right? We need, and again, because of COVID, we have the vacant units in the form of hotels, the vacant units in the form of short-term rentals. So we can stabilize everyone inside the state, but we can't simply do that and then look and not look at the impact that that's having on that surrounding community, right? The community that is taking folks in. We can't have people not be able to go back to work, or their jobs or their hotel simply make money on a federal contract and then not bring their workers back. And certainly, what are they paying those workers? Are they paying a living wage? These federal programs don't have to be so short-sighted. And that's one of the things that I would challenge the folks who are on this call listening to think about as they're designing aid packages moving forward.
Absolutely, that's so helpful. And I know I can't even imagine having worked on this issue and seeing the same problems over and over again, but you're relentless, and I really appreciate all the work that you've been doing in this space. Thanks for joining with us.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Ariadna Godreau-Aubert from Ayuda Legal in Puerto Rico. She is amazing and has been doing tremendous work to help ensure that people have access to FEMA resources, and also to address displacement issues after disaster. So I'll turn it over to her. Ariadna?
Thank you, Sara. First of all, I'm grateful. I'm extremely grateful for the chance to be in this space, and I'm thankful to everyone for just being here and sharing this opportunity with us. So in Puerto Rico, we share a lot of the same concerns that you were all just speaking about. You know, it's been 3 years after the impact of Hurricane Maria, where 70,000 houses were destroyed. It's also been 9 months after and during several seismic events that have destroyed nearly 800 houses in the south of the island, aggravating a crisis that was already there, because the housing crisis in Puerto Rico, just as you all were speaking, precedes the disasters of 2017, of 2019, then the disasters of 2020, and certainly the impact of COVID. I think that, first of all, it is important to say that we are able and we are responsible to foresee the consequences of disaster and to foresee the consequences disasters have on inequitable development. You know, there's a lot of talk and romanticism speaking about survivors, speaking about resilience, but the reality is that there is thousands of people that will never be able to recover from disasters if something is not done from higher levels. And on that same note, listening to you all, I think it's important not to normalize how slow recovery is, not after Katrina, not after Andrew, not after Maria, and not now. And if I want to mention something today, that is that scope of shared responsibility, the way in which agencies such as FEMA, HUD, but also the local government share the responsibility towards immediate response and also about the long-term response in regards to disaster recovery. As in Puerto Rico, after Maria, we had a 60% denial rate from FEMA applications. And the average grant that was given to people for house repairs was $3,200. And that basically exacerbated a crisis that left thousands, nearly 30,000 people without a roof under blue tarps. And that number is still true today, even when the local government is denying that data. Some of the things that we have seen during that process is that Puerto Rico also received an allocation of CDBG-DR funds. $9.7 billion were directed to the island with the idea to promote long-term recovery. 2 years after the first agreement, the local government has just been able to spend less than 2% of the whole grant. And that's not just because recovery is difficult. It also has to do with a lot of boundaries that are set on the inside at a local level, and also because of the boundaries that are set at a federal level and that are part of the report that the National Low-Income Housing Coalition put out. Some of them, in the case of Puerto Rico, affect people without formal title. In Puerto Rico, according to government statistics, nearly half of the population lack a formal title. And that's okay, because nothing in our law requires people to have a formal title to be owners of their houses. Yet, when FEMA came to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, they demanded people to have deeds. And as a consequence, 77,000 people were denied assistance. And they were basically made to be living in very precarious conditions. That same issue is present in the CDBG-DR action plans. We were able to win that fight before FEMA in 2018, and to be able for them to recognize sworn statements so that people could prove alternatively their ownership, just as federal regulations permit. But the local government decided to copy that same boundary and to include it as part of the action plan. And that has, of course, delayed the assistance and the way that people is actually being able to get the funds that they need to finally repair their houses 3 years after Hurricane Maria. Moreover, we also have like other restrictions, like Puerto Rico is the only jurisdictions, and we, of course, are an island, that forbids any kind of substantial repair or reconstruction in flood zones. And this is very important because, of course, the sea level is rising. Puerto Rico is a coast, plus 49% of the people in the island live in one of those landslide-prone zones that are also qualified as risk zones, where reconstruction and repairs are also being forbidden with these CDBG-DR funds. As a consequence, what has happened is that so many boundaries have not only delayed the recovery process, but have also like excluded once again the same people that were denied assistance when FEMA came in 3 years ago. So what we have at this moment is that not only we are in the peak of another hurricane season, we have the earthquakes on top, we have like more austerity, more poverty, because as you were all saying, like the impact of COVID is very present, but also the housing department has only been able to complete the repair of less than 100 houses in this period. According to their estimates and to the promises that the current governor made during the primaries, she said that per month, 300 houses were going to be repaired. That it's unacceptable, because that would mean that the total of the applications that they received, 27,000 applications, that people would actually have a safe roof using that number in 5 to 6 years. That's unacceptable. But not only that, is that is not even happening. Having less than 100 houses being repaired at this moment like represents a risk, an increased risk of displacements for the people in Puerto Rico. Reminding you all that in the last 10 years, we have lost 15% of the population in the island. An island with increased inequality, with increased austerity measures, and with increased budget cuts that affect specifically housing for Black community and for Black communities and low-income communities all over the island. When that happens, not only the title clearance part, but also the displacement, the island has become like a very profitable zone to experiment other sorts of investments that come in. And for example, in the recovery process, you may hear some corporate names that are familiar to people in other jurisdictions, like ICF, like IEM. These same companies are arriving to Puerto Rico, earning these contracts, and finding no accountability measures, as HUD has denounced on audits made to the government of Puerto Rico about the management of funds. The actions that the federal government has taken to address issues of accountability, issues of slow spending are not the best. Like they have put in Puerto Rico, besides the colonial situation that we have, that of course is like the backdrop for everything that's going on. They also put in place like a White House liaison, and they also put in place a SAR of the recovery funds. And that has, of course, like become another obstacle. Instead of fostering, for example, participation and fostering, for example, measures that would permit people without title to be able to have that, to have the chance to receive assistance, and that could also permit people not to be displaced, considering, of course, mitigations, because as you may all know, Puerto Rico has also received $8 billion in mitigation funds. If you displace people before giving them the chance to mitigate, there's no coherence among recovery processes. And that has been a huge part of the fact that recovery has not been attained, and it doesn't look any closer at this moment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ariadna. The amount of work that you've been doing over the last 3 years is incredible, and I hope folks have a chance to look in more to your website and to learn more about the work that you've been doing, because it's just a really good example of how grassroots organizing can be continuing to put pressure on state, local, and federal governments to do better. So appreciate you joining us today. Our next speaker is Chrishelle Palay, who is the Executive Director of the Houston Organizing Movement for Equity, or the HOME Coalition. And I'll turn it over to you, Chrishelle.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for everyone for tuning in today. It's really great to be amongst such leaders in this work. So as Sarah said, I'm the Coalition Director for the HOME Coalition, for the HOME Coalition, and our organization was actually created in response to Hurricane Harvey, to really ensure that Houstonians were able to recover from disaster in an equitable manner. So here we are 3 years after Harvey, and HOME, our members, and several organizations are continuing to work on behalf of families who still have not recovered from the wrath of Harvey. And you know, when you talk about Harvey and Maria and some of these other storms, what you often hear is that floods and disasters like these they're like great levelers, affecting rich and poor alike. But research has shown, along with community members have shown, that the federal aid that follows disasters leave affluent families and white communities much better off, while the poor neighbors of color slip deeper into poverty. And that just that reality, it makes it very known and very clear that there is a grave need for a total reform of the disaster housing recovery system. So as Sara mentioned, of course, there was a convening last year by the National Local Housing Coalition, and they released a paper with several recommendations for policy reform. And though I could talk about a lot of the recommendations that were made, I really want to focus on a few and how it relates to the Houston context and the great need, specifically about FEMA assistance, rebuilding equitable communities, and also the needs for a rights-based approach to mitigation. So everyone so far has already mentioned FEMA. So I would be remiss if I would not share the Houston story of FEMA. And what we find here in Houston, when most folks that in our communities, mostly Black and brown communities, are applying for any FEMA assistance, if a home is older and shows some wear and tear, FEMA very likely will classify the damages as pre-storm damage. And then an offer that, if an offer is made, is typically insufficient when it comes to the need of what the repair what's really needed as far as repairs. But in many cases, those claims are denied altogether. But then also, if a family actually does break through and gets any help from FEMA, the way that the agency actually values loss definitely favors wealthy property owners. And so this is another example of how FEMA does not necessarily fully serve low-income communities, and even more specifically, communities of color. Right now, low-income survivors are really forced to have to navigate the complicated recovery assistance programs like FEMA, like HUD, like the SBA. And although there's a variety of the assistance that's provided at varying income levels, there's not one agency that has the sole responsibility and mission to specifically assist low-income survivors. So there really, really needs to be a dedicated single agency that is identified to address the needs of low-income survivors through the entire course of disaster recovery and response, the entire course. So in addition to response, recovery efforts must also be reformed. And right now, the current long-term disaster recovery efforts really, really exacerbate existing inequities. And in specifically, low-income people of color, people with disabilities, and immigrants face increased disaster-caused displacement from the threat of disinvestment and speculation, which of course it just exacerbates the disparities that were already there. And 3 years after Harvey, we're really seeing this play out in real time. Communities like Cashmere Gardens, which is a Northeast community, historically African-American community, was severely impacted by Hurricane Harvey. And even to this day, it continues to easily flood in the area due to inadequate flooding infrastructure. And the flooding is controlled specifically in this area by open drainage ditches that are actually maintained by property owners. So if you're a low-income homeowner, you have the responsibility of making sure that your drainage in front of your house is cleared. And so in addition to that, Cashmere Gardens is also experiencing a stark increase in property value and speculation. And then add another layer to that, where we now, because of the property value increase and speculation, is causing an increase in property taxes in a community where the average median income is around $20,000 a year. So what we're seeing is during disaster recovery, communities of color and other marginalized communities either return to their segregated, unequal, normal, or the residents are displaced to other areas. So it is critical for disaster recovery planning to go hand in hand with fair housing compliance. So we really want to make sure that we need to rebuild in an effort that explicitly acknowledges and addresses the impacts of racism, segregation, and inequality, specifically on marginalized residents and communities. I mentioned the inadequate investment of flood control measures. And we've traditionally seen a lot of emphasis on rebuilding homes with little to no consideration being given to flood mitigation. So it's good in this moment that we're seeing a more comprehensive approaches moving forward to address housing and flooding mitigation needs collectively. But as these strategies are being developed, it really should be rooted in a community members' rights-based approach to mitigation. And those are 4 different rights. Community members should have a right to choose, meaning that community members who wish to relocate to another area should be provided assistance to actually do so. These community members should also have the right to stay, meaning that community members should not be involuntarily displaced because of mitigation or resiliency efforts. Also, all community members should have the right to equal treatment, meaning that low-income communities must be provided with the same level of flood mitigation and assistance as higher income neighborhoods. And lastly, the right to have a say. Low-income community members should have a right to participate in a meaningful way as municipalities make decisions about their communities. Now, I know I touched on just a few examples of how our disaster housing recovery system is broken, but I really want to stress that we have to recognize the pervasive and inherent presence of structural racism and inequality in this system. The act of perpetuating structural inequality like this may not be intentional, but these are the effects, and we have to recognize that. But as long as disaster recovery does not intentionally address the plight of people of color and those neglected during the last disaster and the ones before that, then we're going to continue to face a greater distortion in how communities truly recover. Recovery efforts must be intentionally inclusive, and equity must be explicitly addressed at all stages of response and recovery.
Thank you so much, Chrishelle. That's really powerful to frame it in terms of those 4 rights that survivors should all be guaranteed to have. And I know that you've done enormous work pointing out how, the mantra of building back to the way we were before, that's sort of the attitude that FEMA approaches disaster recovery with. It's really, in this context, would be rebuilding back a segregated community with racial inequities and disparities. And unless we're having a concerted effort to undo those systemic failures, then we're going to see them play out again. So I appreciate you joining us and sharing that information with us. Okay. So our next speaker is Dave Ramler. He's an attorney with Fair Share Housing Center of New Jersey. He worked with us to publish the 2 reports that we mentioned earlier on the webinar, but I'll turn it over to him to talk about some of the persistent challenges that he's been seeing in disaster housing recovery.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll tell folks that I have a long history of federal housing law, but really got involved in disaster recovery after Superstorm Sandy hit New Jersey, and I've been working in this ever since. And the sad truth is that as I listen to all the other presenters, and many of them I work with all the time, we see the same issues repeated and the same lack of FEMA having any ability to learn from its past. And so if you can see me, you can see I'm in a car because I'm not in my office today. So I'm going to take you on a little journey. And the journey is going to be step by step, 5 or 6 points through how FEMA addresses recovery. And some of it repeats what people have said, but that it really demonstrates how these are persistent and pervasive issues. So first point is that FEMA does very narrowly interpret its Stafford Act authority. And it has repeatedly stated that its job is to make things like they were before the event. What a terrible idea. It ignores all of the suffering of all of the folks who survived it and the losses for those who didn't. And this perception of its role manifests itself in a number of ways. So first, how it assesses the unmet needs of the people who are in the impacted area. And its assessment really favors, as has been said, homeowners. And I recommend to people the book, The Color of Law, if you haven't read it, because it it goes into the factual and legal background of the kind of structural and historic systemic discrimination that every one of our speakers has spoken about. And whether it is the way the federal, state, and local laws created middle-class white suburbs where people own their homes, and urban ghettos where people rent from absentee landlords, or they live on an island which was acquired through colonial military expansion. We have a racist system that we're faced with. So many of the most important efforts that FEMA should make are to respond to renters. And they count very little in their assessment if a family of renters has lost every object they ever owned, swept away in a flood, or burned in a fire. FEMA really sort of disregards that in how it approaches its assessment of the damage. They have repeatedly failed to train their inspectors in how to evaluate the loss of manufactured housing units. And manufactured housing units represent tens and hundreds of thousands of low-income people's homes. And after Sandy, we saw housing community after manufactured housing community totally ignored, because the FEMA inspectors don't understand that once you get mold in the insulation under the floor, the unit is effectively scrap metal. You can't. There are injuries to those kind of units that are not obvious unless you're trained. And this happened also, and in addition, after Sandy, it happened in California after the wildfires in 2017 and 2018. Their inspectors had not learned in the 6 years since Sandy that they needed to understand the nature of the damages that are caused to manufactured housing units. And then you move from homeowners to renters to manufactured housing owners, and then homeless. FEMA effectively says homeless people don't exist because they were homeless before the event. It's not our job to make them housed after the event. So they have this very skewed view of how they assess damage. And then they have an application process, which is the next stage in how you move through hopefully a recovery. But as has been said, they have confusing, inflexible, and inaccessible criteria for obtaining assistance. And many of our speakers have talked about that. They also they routinely set up case management offices in areas which are either not in the impacted community or not accessible to survivors. Because one, as has been said, if you don't have a phone, you can't call the office and they can't call you. And if your car has been destroyed, you can't drive there. And probably to find any kind of housing at all, you were displaced some distance from your original housing. So FEMA really fails to put together a kind of system which allows people access. Then they deny for people applications for totally irrational positions, just like the title issue in Puerto Rico. So next we move to, we've gone through how they view the world, how they assess the damage, how they have what kind of application process they have, and then the question is what programs do they set up in response to that? And Sara said earlier, there are housing programs which state and local governments and members of Congress have tried to get FEMA to approve, and they won't approve them. In the last serious number of disasters, the federal declaration only approved individual assistance for crisis counseling. FEMA has the ability to approve individual assistance to survivors and injured families over a broad range of possible assistance levels and types. And they have simply refused to do it, saying that it's not our job. It's not our job. If it's not our fault if we have to kick people out of hotels on some arbitrary date and the crisis counseling folks haven't been able to create a sustainable housing plan for that family. And when we think that FEMA has to reevaluate its role, or it has to be replaced by, as has been said, a uniform agency which looks at the continuum from pre-event mitigation through the event, through the short-term and the long-term recovery, and it has to be a coherent, coordinated effort. And one of the things that was mentioned, and we think is really important that we learned from Sandy, was that the data has to be collected. There must be granular and comprehensive data collected on all applications for assistance. Every applicant gets a case number. That case number has detailed demographic information, race, ethnicity, income, household size, whether you rent or you own, and that application has to be tracked. On September 1, this happened. On October 1, this happened. The case was denied for this reason. The appeal, what was the appeal process? How is it implemented? All of that has to be in place. After Sandy, we forced the disclosure of all of this information, and we were able to show data very similar to what Sara Saadian said earlier, that it's the Houston data of $60,000 for white middle-class folks and $84 for Black and Latino folks. Well, we were able to show that the discrimination that was a result of the FEMA actions. We were able to force the state to move over $500 million into programs which developed rental housing, affordable rental housing in the communities that were devastated by Superstorm Sandy. So it can be done, but there has to be, if we're talking about federal law, they should be required to collect the data and to make it publicly available in searchable, usable format, and be subject to the public scrutiny of how they're acting. So it's a continuum, but I think we have, as has been said, a lot of the suggested answers and concepts on how to move forward. And I thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining with us, Dave. I know we agree with you so much about this complete lack of transparency is what allows for all of these negative outcomes to continue to happen over and over again. And without the data that you're talking about for applications, it's just going to continue more. So I appreciate you pointing that out on today's call. Our last speaker is Trey Reffitt, who works on housing and infrastructure issues for Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii. He's going to talk about some legislation that he's been working on, and I'll turn it over to you, Trey.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for all the speakers before me and setting the stage for needs for dramatic action. You all have gone into great detail on the shortcomings of federal policy and have largely informed the senator's views on what needs to change. Specific to Kauai, on May 3rd, 2018, the Kilauea volcano eruption began in Lower Puna. After several months of volcanic activity, the community was covered at points with 20 feet of molten lava, and in the most dramatic example, Fissure 8, which sat on a residential property, grew to almost 16 stories tall, and now replaces a home and farmland. That community is forever changed. And last week, the community action plan was due from Hawaii County to HUD, 28 months after the volcano began erupting. That community has been waiting all that time for federal resources from HUD to assist in the rebuilding effort. To make matters worse, HUD announced 2 weeks ago that an additional allocation of CDBG-DR will be coming to the community because of insufficient data shared by FEMA originally to inform the original allocation. Those two facts, I think, are hit home with Senator Schatz, but are emblematic of the problem that we're facing. If 2 years, nearly more than 2 years after the fact, the federal government is still collecting data and beginning the process for recovery, we have already failed those members of the community. So at the end of last year, Senator Schatz introduced with a colleague, Senator Todd Young of Indiana, a CDBG DR reform bill. Included in that is a permanent authorization of the CDBG DR program. The intention is to formalize the structure of that program and stop doing it on an ad hoc basis, leaving HUD and the communities to anticipate what the rules of the road will be going forward, and instead give everybody confidence on what recovery will likely look like. Included in the bill is also a shift in direction for HUD, the establishment of the Office of Resilient Communities and Resilient Communities and Disaster Recovery, to task HUD with building out their recovery staff, but also begin more formalized efforts towards resilience planning. So it is not left to communities on their own to start baking in this concept of resilience in low-income and vulnerable communities. Oftentimes the conversation around resiliency, and you all know this, is left out of discussions of supporting affordable housing in low-income communities. It's seen as a nice to have extra, but all the speakers before me have shown that if we think of it as an extra, as an add-on, as a nice to have, we've already failed those communities. We're leaving people behind, and we're actually leading them to potential death if we don't invest and act now. So the senator is going to continue to advocate for that authorization to improve that program. He's also working on 2 other bills that are of interest to significantly reform the disaster recovery process. One is an evolution of the DHAP program that also builds off of the rental assistance program included in the HEROES Act, and that is to develop a voucher program, that is a mandatory voucher program that is available to disaster impacted communities through HUD, that defines disaster impacted as those that experience a disaster as a result of a natural hazard, but also as a result of an acute and localized economic crisis. So if a community has had a dramatic rise in unemployment, we should recognize that disasters come in multiple forms, and we're seeing that with COVID. That although you might not see it on the news, that still impacts those communities, and we need to address the supports necessary for families to reestablish themselves and then thrive after the fact. He's developing that in collaboration with key stakeholders and hopes to have that bill introduced relatively soon. The third effort that we're working on is to totally rethink how we assess federal, state, and local actions as a result of disasters, to create a national disaster safety board modeled after the National Transportation Safety Board, an independent body that brings experts from relevant stakeholders together to assess disasters that result in 10 or more fatalities or extreme economic loss. To really get at those disasters that have hit communities of all levels, not just urban communities, not affluent communities, but rural and remote communities as well, and say, what are the underlying structures that have failed these individuals that led to loss of life, and how do we change that? Whether that's in the private sector, the local government, state government, or federal government. Taken together, we just need to have a clear and honest assessment of how we are responding as local governments and federal governments to the communities in need, and make the changes necessary to give the supports when they need to be there, and in a way that gets to the people that need it most, for them to move on from the event.
Great. Thank you so much, Trey. We really appreciate your leadership on this, and please, send our appreciation to the senator too. I know that for folks on the line, we strongly support the legislation that Senator Schatz has introduced and are working actively to try to move that forward. Trey, could you remind us what the name is of the CDBG-DR bill, and if you have the bill number in case folks want to engage on that?
Yes, it's S2301, Reforming Disaster Recovery Act of 2019.
Great, thanks. And now we'll turn it over to some Q&A. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I encourage anybody to pose a question to our speakers, and so I'll give it a minute or so for folks to go on the line. But one question we've had is, how can we engage more? This is open to any of our panelists. How can we engage more nonprofit organizations in disaster recovery, since they clearly have the mission of serving low-income and marginalized communities? How can we help include more nonprofits in that process? Any suggestions from our speakers?
Well, I'll say that after Sandy, the volunteer organizations active in disasters and a number of other local groups were on the street the day after the storm, and they helped people with the immediate needs that could not be provided by the slow grind of government response. So they would provide food, they would provide refrigerators, they would provide things that help that family sustain their lives through, as has been just said, this long process of getting federal money into the program. I think there's the stopgap there. And while FEMA does require many communities to have disaster management programs and plans, they're not often that well created or understood even by the local people who are supposed to enforce them. And I will say what Trey talked about, the long time that Congress took to allocate funds in response to the volcanic eruption. If you can go on the websites, HUD website, and you can see that after Sandy, Congress appropriated the money within 3 months, but after Maria, it was years. And they're just getting slower. And so there's this gap. And I think the government should figure out a way to respond to it, but it hasn't so far.
That's right. I agree with, oh, sorry, Chrishelle.
Go ahead.
I agree with David. Katrina, that was one of them. Again, it was emblematic of the failure of government, that nonprofits and volunteers were on the ground. And it also kind of gives governments a way out because they should be the first on the ground. The social safety net, the governmental safety net should be what responds first. And frankly, nonprofits and philanthropic organizations should be plugging the holes, catching the gaps, the people that don't quite meet. That's a functioning system. And instead, what we keep doing is waiting on nonprofits to step up first. And again, when you have a disaster, when you already have a COVID happening, so you have philanthropy and nonprofits already stretched to capacity, and then you compound that with a Laurel, with a wildfire situation, with flooding, with whatever disaster strikes, it's a recipe for disaster. We have got to get the nonprofits and philanthropy have a role to play. There's a part for them, but it should be on closing gaps, not as the tip of the spear.
And I was just going to add, Andreanecia kind of started to point to it, but I want to really uplift that. Of course, when this work started, this was before the era of COVID. And so now that we are in this moment of COVID, we are looking at an impending eviction crisis. Although, yes, the CDC has released an order, we know that there are ways in which, there are going to be gaping holes in which there needs to be some real enforcement of our local municipalities to enforce it. And so what's happening, I know specifically in Houston, that there is this uprising, this like grassroots uprising to ensure and really try to raise blow the whistle on, this is not just a cure-all, a cure for it all. And so I would just encourage folks to also just be on the, even although disaster recovery and DR may be something that you're really focused on, is to think about ways in which like the exterior forces that really touches, disaster recovery and the people. It's not the issue, it's the people, right? And so how are these populations being most impacted yet again? And meet folks at that intersection and find out what the needs are. Then also there's this whole inside-outside game, right? Where a lot of times folks that are decision makers are gonna listen to, philanthropy, and listen to some of the big box, nonprofits. And so if you can meet folks where they're at, understand what their needs are, in this COVID moment, and then carry the message, and also, put a layer on there. Oh, and by the way, we're still recovering from that disaster 3 years ago and 15 years ago and before that. That's just something to consider and try to reframe and look at this differently.
Absolutely. One of the questions I frequently get, and so I'll open it up to you guys to answer this too, is how is this pandemic similar or different to natural disasters? Obviously, it's very different in terms of, we weren't expecting to have a global pandemic in 2020, and it's very different in many ways than a natural hurricane or a wildfire. But I'm wondering if you could help point out to folks on the line, in what ways is it similar? And I think we would all agree that it's one of the key ways that it's similar is that we're still seeing that the very poorest households and most marginalized households are still waiting for help, are still living right on the cusp, and are almost going to be evicted from their homes. We estimate up to 40 million renters will be evicted from their homes by the end of the year when the federal moratorium lifts. But other households, businesses have received the assistance that they need. So I want to turn to you guys to maybe help illustrate some of those, the continuous nature of these challenges and how we're seeing it play out with the pandemic. I'm going to volunteer Andreanecia because I saw her nodding along.
Sorry, I had to unmute. So yeah, I was nodding along. So there's a lot of differences, right? Because number one, you don't have the impact on the built environment, but the similarities are how it is revealing the inequities and actually, unfortunately, reinforcing a lot of those inequities. We use the term essential worker to kind of, point to jab at people to look at the, the wage disparities. That's still not resonating, right? That's not working. That you have elected officials talking about the $600 in unemployment that's now been cut to $600 to $300, and you still have legislators with straight faces talking about people refusing to go back to work, which demonstrates a wildly inaccurate understanding of unemployment insurance. That they don't understand that if your job calls you back, even if you're making less than that $15 an hour, you won't get that. You won't get to keep that unemployment insurance. You will have to pay it back. That we've already put these kind of, these guardrails in place to stop fraud. We've already done that. But still, those lines are what's repeated over and over and over and over again, like they're the truth. And the fact that we are not looking at what is necessary to stabilize everyone, which is housing. Housing is essential inside of this crisis, stabilizing everyone. And that the pandemic didn't have us in the midst of a renaissance is a tragedy. That these disasters that have happened in recent months, the continued catastrophes, all stem from our failure to embrace the fact that we really do need to destigmatize housing, and we need to recognize that it is an essential, it's more than a right, it needs to be guaranteed for everyone. And we are nowhere near that right now. And so that's what disaster after disaster after disaster just constantly reinforces that. And it's somewhat disheartening at this point.
Any other speakers who want to add on to that, build on that? Okay, well, I want to thank everybody.
I bummed everybody out, sorry.
You did a great job, that's why. I want to thank everybody for joining with us today. We appreciate it. On the slide in front of you, we have copies of the two-part report that we published with Fair Share Housing Center of New Jersey. We also have a list of what our top priorities are for the next disaster recovery package for Hurricane Laura and the Iowa derecho. So please check that out, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.